I wasn't looking for giants when I started digging into Egypt's royal history. I was looking at proportions. Doorways too tall, stone boxes too large, thrones that seemed designed for bodies broader and longer than our own. The kind of details historians usually file under symbolism, ceremony, or exaggerated grandeur, and then move on. But then the pattern started repeating. Not in one temple, not in one tomb, across dynasties, across sites, across spaces that were supposed to be ritual, administrative, funerary, and royal all at once. Massive passageways, colossal seated figures, sarcophagi so oversized they strain the official explanation, chambers that feel less monumental when you stop looking at them as monuments and start looking at them as functional spaces. And that's when the standard story started to feel thin. Because Egypt is full of things we're told were built to impress, to humble, to symbolize cosmic power. But symbolism has become a kind of escape hatch, hasn't it? A way to stop asking practical questions. Why this scale? Why these dimensions? Why this repeated emphasis on bodies larger than life, in contexts tied directly to kingship, burial, and divine authority? The deeper I went, the stranger it got. Temple reliefs show pharaohs towering over attendants, enemies, priests, and servants. That part is familiar. We're told it's hierarchical scale, a visual language, a way of showing status, not literal size. And maybe sometimes it is. But then you notice how often this oversized figure is not just larger in art, but tied to physical spaces built at overwhelming scale. Not just the image, the seat, the chamber, the stone enclosure, the doorway, the coffin. Always the same pattern. Explain it symbolically, categorize it aesthetically, move on. Never stop long enough to ask whether the art and the architecture are reinforcing something more literal than we've allowed ourselves to consider. Because what if the scale wasn't purely symbolic? What if at least part of Egypt's royal iconography preserved the memory of a ruling class, guardian class, or elite bloodline whose proportions were genuinely unusual? Not mythical giants in the storybook sense, not 12-foot monsters, something more disturbing than that. Real people, exceptionally large people, large enough to alter architecture, burial equipment, and courtly display. Once that question enters your mind, a lot of Egypt starts looking different. Take the sarcophagi. There are granite boxes in Egypt that don't just look heavy, they look excessive, oversized beyond the needs of an average human body. Some are said to be for sacred animals. Some are assigned ritual purposes so confidently that the measurements themselves almost disappear behind the explanation. But why are so many royal and elite burial containers built with such overwhelming internal volume? Why the repeated preference for scale far beyond necessity? Why does the architecture around them often mirror that same inflation of proportion? And why do the explanations keep defaulting to reverence instead of function? The Serapeum is one of those places that keeps pulling people back. Officially, those huge stone boxes are tied to the Apis bulls, sacred animals buried with extraordinary honor. That is the accepted interpretation. But the question lingers anyway. Why such precision? Why such mass? Why such an obsession with containers at scales that make even elite human burial seem almost small by comparison? And that question doesn't stay isolated for long. Because Egypt's royal world is full of enlarged bodies, enlarged objects, enlarged spaces. Colossal seated rulers carved from stone, enormous statues standing guard at temple entrances, thrones that elevate the royal body into something beyond ordinary anatomy. It's all dismissed as ideology, the king as more than man, the ruler as divine, the body as metaphor. But what if metaphor was preserving memory? What if later interpreters inherited a world already shaped by larger bodies and translated that reality into symbolism because symbolism was safer than biology? That would explain a lot. It would explain why so many Egyptian figures of power are not merely emphasized but magnified, why the body of the ruler is treated as a separate category of being,
why royal bloodlines are obsessed with purity, continuity, and isolation, why kingship in Egypt feels less like a job and more like a species of sacred inheritance. And it would explain why the strangest clues cluster around royalty. Not peasants, not market life, not ordinary dwellings. Royal chambers, elite tombs, monumental enclosures, ritual precincts, the architecture of command.
Ask yourself something simple. If unusually large people existed within a dynastic elite, where would we expect the evidence to survive? Not in village homes, not in fragile domestic furniture. We'd expect it in stone, in funerary equipment, in ceremonial space, in the architecture least likely to be destroyed. And that is exactly where the anomalies keep appearing. Look at the seated colossi. We're told their size is propaganda in stone. Fair enough. But propaganda usually exaggerates what already matters. It takes a real quality and amplifies it. Strength becomes superhuman. Authority becomes divine. Scale becomes cosmic. The question is not whether exaggeration exists. It obviously does. The question is what seed of reality it may be exaggerating. Why does royal legitimacy in Egypt so often present itself through bodily enormity? Why is physical scale one of the most repeated visual signatures of power? Why does the elite body appear not just holier, but different? Because if the difference were only symbolic, the architecture around it wouldn't need to echo that same language so persistently. And yet it does. Corridors that widen into overwhelming spaces, thresholds that seem built less for intimacy than procession, stone seats that elevate the body into a category beyond the human crowd, chambers where everything feels slightly too large, slightly too elevated, slightly too far removed from ordinary use. Each one can be explained away on its own. That is always how these things work. One oversized coffin, ceremony. One colossal statue, political theater. One giant doorway, monumental design. One exaggerated relief, artistic convention. But stack them together, and the official explanations start doing less and less work, because then it's no longer one anomaly, it's a system. A visual and architectural system centered on enlarged royal presence. And then there are the remains themselves. This is where the conversation gets quiet. Ancient Egypt has produced mummies, skeletons, and fragments from across millennia, but how many people actually examine the measurements behind elite remains, rather than just the names attached to them? How often are irregular proportions presented to the public without being absorbed into broad labels like pathology, post-mortem distortion, or uncertainty of reconstruction? There have always been reports of unusually tall individuals in antiquity. Sometimes they are treated as curiosities. Sometimes they are folded into legend. Sometimes they are dismissed as exaggeration by ancient writers. But Egypt is one of the few civilizations where kings were not just remembered as powerful, they were remembered as physically set apart. And the line between biology and divinity was intentionally blurred. That blur matters, because once something is framed as sacred, it becomes harder to analyze materially. Once a ruler is considered godlike, unusual physical features can be absorbed into religious language. A broader frame becomes majesty. Greater height becomes iconography. A different skull shape becomes stylization. A bloodline anomaly becomes divine inheritance. And then the evidence stops being read as evidence. It becomes style. That may be the most efficient erasure of all. Not destroying the traces, reclassifying them. Turning every physical irregularity into symbolic art, turning every oversized chamber into ceremonial grandeur, turning every royal exaggeration into theology, until the literal possibility disappears beneath the interpretation. And then there is Amarna, because no matter how hard you try to stay with standard dynastic imagery, Akhenaten keeps interrupting the conversation. His depictions are among the strangest in ancient history. Elongated skull, long face, narrow chest, wide hips, extended limbs. An entire family rendered with proportions so unusual that generations of scholars have argued over whether the style is symbolic, pathological, theological, or something else entirely. Officially, it is generally treated as artistic revolution, a deliberate break from convention. Maybe. But why did that break take this form? Why the elongated anatomy? Why the insistence on difference? Why does the repeated presentation of the royal family as biologically distinct from everyone around them? Why does the ruling body suddenly look less idealized and more alien to the ordinary human template? And why are we so certain that all of it must be artistic invention? Because if even part of it reflects inherited physical traits within a royal line, then the entire conversation changes. Then we're no longer dealing only with symbolism. We're dealing with memory.
Memory of a bloodline that may have preserved proportions, cranial forms, or bodily features later generations no longer knew how to explain except through divinity and style. That possibility becomes even stranger when you remember how obsessed Egypt was with lineage. Royal marriages were tightly controlled, bloodlines were protected. In some periods they were folded inward, brother to sister, family to family, purity elevated over normal biological caution. Historians explain this through divine kingship, inheritance, and legitimacy. That explanation makes sense, but it may not be the whole story. What if those lineages were preserving something specific, something physical, something considered essential to rule? That would explain the obsession with descent, the visual separation of kings from subjects, the repeated treatment of rulers not merely as chosen by the gods, but as fundamentally unlike the population beneath them. And it would explain why later history softens the difference. Because once the bloodline weakens, once dynasties fracture, once empires conquer Egypt and absorb its symbols, the old reality could survive only as iconography. The body becomes metaphor because the body itself is gone. If that happened, the erasure wouldn't look dramatic. It would look scholarly. The old giant becomes a god. The unusual skeleton becomes an anomaly. The oversized coffin becomes ceremony. The impossible chamber becomes pageantry. The bloodline becomes myth, and history moves on. Consider how often Egypt's greatest stone spaces feel scaled for encounter rather than habitation, not for crowds exactly, for presence, for procession, for bodies entering under towering lintels toward seated forms that dwarf the viewer. That experience is usually described in emotional terms: awe, submission, reverence. But architecture shaped around awe can still be shaped around memory. Memory of what power physically looked like. Memory of bodies that once fit those proportions better than we do. And here's the part that keeps bothering me. If Egypt's royal past really did preserve traces of unusually large or physically distinct elites, we wouldn't expect modern institutions to announce it clearly. Not because of some theatrical conspiracy, because academia rewards stable interpretations, museums reward coherent labels, tourism rewards clean narratives. Once a framework hardens, every new anomaly gets forced back inside it, not debated, managed. A giant stone seat becomes symbolic kingship. A strange skull becomes deformation. A body larger than expected becomes isolated pathology. A repeated pattern becomes coincidence. That's not active suppression in the cinematic sense, it's passive erasure. And passive erasure is usually more effective, because no one has to destroy the evidence if everyone agrees in advance what the evidence is allowed to mean. That may be why Egypt feels so strange, even when fully explained. The explanations are polished, detailed, professional, often convincing in isolation. But when you line the patterns side by side, something starts slipping through the cracks. The repeated bodily magnification of rulers, the architecture of enlarged passage and containment, the obsession with dynastic blood, the peculiar anatomical depictions, the massive funerary equipment, the sense that royal Egypt was preserving not just power, but proportion, and then hiding it in plain sight. Let me propose something that sounds extreme until you sit with it for a while. What if Egypt's earliest royal institutions were shaped in part by a class of giant or near-giant elites? Not fantasy titans, not creatures from folklore, a physically larger ruling or guardian caste whose scale was uncommon enough to command reverence and common enough within elite circles to shape design, burial, and visual culture. What if later Egyptians remembered them as divine kings? What if later historians inherited those traces but translated them into symbolism because literal interpretation had become unacceptable? It would explain why royal figures are so often represented at overwhelming scale, even when they are not gods in the abstract, but named rulers tied to dynastic lines. It would explain why tomb equipment and ceremonial architecture often feel too large first and symbolic second. It would explain why certain bodies are treated as though they belong to another order of being. And it would explain the strange fusion in Egypt between politics and anatomy, because kingship there is not merely legal, it is embodied. The ruler's body matters. The ruler's blood matters. The ruler's form matters. Again and again, the body itself is the argument for authority. That is not a trivial detail. That is the center of the mystery. How many features of Egyptian monumentality make more sense if they began as practical accommodations before they became symbolic traditions? How many oversized forms continued long after the bodies that inspired them had become rare? How many rituals survived as echoes of a biological hierarchy people no longer fully understood? Tradition can outlive function for centuries. We know that. Uniforms outlive warfare styles. Titles outlive real power. Rituals outlive the beliefs that created them. So why couldn't architecture outlive the bodies it was first designed around? Why couldn't enlarged royal design survive long after the original physical rationale had faded into sacred custom? That possibility changes everything, because then the monuments are not merely showing us what Egyptians believed, they may be showing us what they remembered. And memory, especially royal memory, is rarely honest in direct language. It encodes, it glorifies, it mythologizes, it turns ancestry into divinity, and difference into destiny. If giants once stood near the beginning of Egypt's royal story, we should expect the evidence to arrive broken apart. One clue in reliefs, one clue in stone dimensions, one clue in burial scale, one clue in bloodline obsession, one clue in abnormal portraits. Never enough by itself, always too much in aggregate. What disturbs me most is not that the evidence is incomplete. Of course it is. Ancient history is always incomplete. What disturbs me is how quickly the question is dismissed before the pattern is even allowed to exist. Mention giant royal bodies in Egypt and the conversation shuts down before it begins. Not investigated, not tested, just filed under fringe and forgotten. But why? Why is it acceptable to speak of divine kings, hybrid gods, resurrected rulers, cosmic creation dramas, and sacred bloodlines, but unacceptable to ask whether some of those traditions grew out of real biological difference? Why are we comfortable calling the rulers of Egypt more than human in theology, but not willing to ask whether they may have been more than average in flesh? Why does the official story explain every oversized feature separately, but resist any unified explanation that links them together? Because unified patterns are dangerous. A single anomaly can be ignored. A pattern starts demanding a revision. And Egypt, more than almost any civilization, has been stabilized into a narrative too elegant to disturb. Monumental genius, sacred kingship, symbolic art, dynastic continuity, ritual death, rebirth. It is a beautiful framework, maybe mostly correct, but frameworks become prisons when nothing outside them is allowed to matter. The giants, if they existed, would have been absorbed into that prison perfectly, turned into gods, turned into metaphors, turned into style, until the literal memory was gone and only the stones kept whispering it. The colossal statues remain, the oversized chambers remain, the immense stone boxes remain, the enlarged royal body remains, carved into walls over and over again. And we keep telling ourselves it is all just visual language. Maybe it is, but maybe visual language is exactly where history hides what it no longer wants to say plainly. Because the old world rarely erases itself completely. It leaves distortions, scale mismatches, ritual leftovers, symbols too specific to be arbitrary, architecture that remembers bodies we no longer admit were real. Egypt is full of those distortions, full of spaces that feel inherited rather than invented, full of rulers presented as though ordinary humanity could not contain them. And maybe ordinary humanity couldn't. Maybe that is the secret buried beneath the polished stone and the official labels, that Egypt's royal history did not begin with men becoming gods in the imagination. It began with a lineage so physically imposing, so set apart, so entangled with power, that later generations could only preserve it by mythologizing it. That would be the cleanest erasure of all. Not removing the giants from history, renaming them, calling them divine, calling them symbolic, calling them impossible, until no one remembered they may have once walked through those doorways, sat on those thrones, and lay inside those stone chambers as flesh and blood rulers of a world that now survives only in scale. And when you see the pattern, when you stop isolating each anomaly and let them stand together, you end up in a very uncomfortable place. You have to ask why Egypt's royal world was so obsessed with enlarged presence. You have to ask whether the body of the ruler was treated as a category apart. You have to ask whether some of the most monumental architecture on Earth was preserving the memory of monumental humans. And you have to ask what else was compressed into myth when history decided those bodies no longer belonged in the story. The monuments still stand. The proportions still challenge us. The royal images still stare down at us from temple walls, massive and calm and impossibly self-assured. Maybe they were only symbols, or maybe they were the last honest record of something royal history tried very hard to turn into legend. If so, then the giants were never fully erased, only translated. And the stones have been trying to tell us that the entire time.